This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
A man's man, an American literary icon. We talk Hemingway with author Dr. David Earle on this edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for joining us. Ernest Hemingway, for some, the personification of masculinity. Zsa Zsa Gabor once said, "Hemingway's such an outdoor man, so different in every way from women. He's more masculine than anyone he's ever written about." Well, apparently those beliefs were not isolated to Zsa Zsa. In his book, All Man, Hemingway, 1950s men's magazines, and the masculine persona, Dr. David Earle examines Hemingway and his influence on popular culture. Dr. Earle has a PhD from the University of Miami and is an assistant professor at the University of West Florida. Recently, he brought home 3 awards from the 2010 Book Expo America for his book, All Man Hemingway, 1950s men's magazines and the masculine persona. Dr. Earle, welcome.
Great.
Nice to see you.
Nice to
Appreciate
see you
you coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What first began your fascination with Ernest Hemingway?
Well, you know, actually I think I have a little bit of a different approach to Hemingway that started, whereas an awful lot of kids and college students approach Hemingway through kind of modernist literature and his circle of James Joyce and Ezra Pound. I actually kind of approached it from pulp magazines and my reading history, which would have started back in grade school with people like Edgar Rice Burroughs and Tarzan and those stories, and I kind of worked my way up from the fantasy and adventure, science fiction, to hard-boiled literature, and from authors like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. I thought it was a very, very small jump over to Ernest Hemingway and his kind of hard-boiled style of writing. And I think that actually kind of influenced my approach, especially as you can see in this book, to him as not so much a highbrow literary author, but as a popular author.
Interestingly enough, as I was reading in the book, now your family had some connection with Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah, well, that's true as well. As a matter of fact, Hemingway was kind of a household name in my family. I was actually born in Sun Valley, Idaho. It's where he lived the last few years of his life and where he died. And my parents lived there all through the 50s and 60s. My dad was actually one of the 3 doctors in Sun Valley. And if you know about Sun Valley, back in the 50s and 60s, it was kind of its high point of popularity as this resort where the rich and famous kind of hobnobbed with the cowboys out in the Wild West. So you would see people like Jimmy Stewart in the casino next to a ranch hand, right? So my parents lived there. My mom was a nurse, my dad was a doctor, and they actually knew Hemingway. My mom was one of his nurses when he was kind of failing and frail in his last few years, and my father had taken care of Mary Hemingway when she had fallen and broken her arm in a hunting accident. So I kind of grew up hearing these stories about this real man, gentle, very soft-spoken, yet still very much of a presence, and you know, that seemed, especially when I got off to grad school, at odds with this public image of Hemingway as this, you know, blustery adventurer.
Right.
It didn't sound like the very kind of charitable, the very sweet person that my parents described. Not that he didn't have trouble, especially in his last few years.
Right.
But I think it's exactly that type of contrast that he embodies between this kind of larger-than-life persona and this sensitive persona that comes out in an awful lot of his fiction as well. So this book is kind of I don't know, what would say, a navigation between these extremities of a celebrity public persona and real persona, or the 50s has kind of that idealized decade that's been passed down to us when really it was not so very ideal. So to a certain extent, I'm trying to kind of take the lid off of these type of American myths, sort of, in the book.
You know, some of the reading I did in hearing you talk, Hemingway was extremely popular from a celebrity type popularity, And you say that was unusual for writers of that era.
Yeah, I think actually for any era, celebrities, well, let's say Hemingway celebrity is unusual. And if you think, going back for hundreds of years, of another author that reached that type of celebrity, and you really, I think you'd be hard put to find one that had that type of celebrity over a very long extended period of time. You know, there might be a scandal, there might be, for example, someone like Washington Irving or even Charles Dickens, who did have a level of celebrity, but it didn't approach the kind of modern level of celebrity that Hemingway did, which is really similar more so to movie stars and to sports legends and to people like that. I suppose someone like Stephen King might be a bit of a literary celebrity, but not kind of the almost pin-up celebrity that Hemingway would have been in the 1950s. You know, I mean, he really had a kind of a popular cachet and continues to do so now. I mean, how many other authors have their name on, well, restaurants and on lines of furniture and on lines of clothing and things like that?
Right.
So yeah, so really, he's a kind of a rare bird.
How did that come about? What separated him from the rest of them?
I think a lot of it came from his lifestyle. I mean, there's not one simple answer for that. There are actually quite a few really complex answers. First and foremost, I think it's his lifestyle and the fact that he had this really kind of larger-than-life persona that he himself marketed. His writing, which is always about kind of write what you know, is often, as far as situationally, very close to his biography. Not that his persona is necessarily close to his own, his actual, how he actually was, but you know, so he would travel in Spain and he would write about traveling in Spain. He would be interested in the bullfights, write about training. So it's always live what you know. So I think in popular culture, often this blurred the lines between his fiction and himself. Not only that, but he was incredibly photogenic. It just so happens that kind of as he started publishing and has the sort of marketing machine behind him started to roll, it was also the rise of photo magazines, of a kind of new visuality in America. This switch from radio and print to say film and television to photo digests, things like that. All of which, between the 30s and the 50s, took advantage of his photogenic persona. So I think those things roll into the celebrity. There are other aspects. His literature itself is approachable. It can be kind of sanctioned by academia and by literary critics, and at the same time it can be enjoyed by just about anybody. And this is something that he worked incredibly hard to do. So those are some of the reasons behind that kind of...
So he was a good self-promoter as well.
Oh, yeah, very much so. You know, if you look at his nonfiction, not just in books like The Green Hills of Africa, but also in a lot of his stories that he wrote for, say, Esquire, started in the mid-30s, they might nominally be about something like fishing or hunting, but with his kind of journalism, they always end up somehow being more about Hemingway himself than about the subject. And of course, a lot of these were published with photos of him. You know, the very first issue of Esquire in the fall of 1933, which was the editors of that wanted to start a men's magazine that was about, it actually started as a man's fashion magazine. It was only going to be distributed in men's clothing stores. And the reason for that is what they wanted to do is they wanted to kind of create a man's Vogue. But of course, there was sort of this stigma against men caring about things like the clothes they wore and shopping. It was way before the metrosexual male, right?
Right.
So what they did is they took Esquire and they loaded it full of kind of hyper-masculine figures. They had Dashiell Hammett and they had John Dos Passos and they had Ernest Hemingway write the very first story in there, which is a letter, a Cuban letter about fishing for marlin. And of course, it's incredibly kind of authoritative. His voice, the Papa voice, comes through, and this is what you want to do. This is how one fishes for marlin the correct way, the proper way. And what accompanies it is about a dozen photographs, most of him with his trophy catches. So over the course of this over the course of not just this article, but all these articles, he's really putting himself out there. He's really promoting himself as an expert on things. Right. And I think that this kind of snowballs, especially by the end of the Second World War. He's been writing journalism for Collier's, which is, you know, millions and millions circulation. His picture accompanies all these articles. He's just had a Book of the Month Club bestseller. I think paperback sales, things like this. So suddenly he's available to an entire new generation of readers, and he's established himself as kind of like the expert on war and the expert on, well, the trauma of war and other things that he's written about after the First World War. And the entire generation just kind of grasps him, men and women, and he becomes this, you know, there's no question about his level of celebrity. Yeah.
He's kind of the quintessential, you know, men want to be like him and women want to date him or be married or whatever in that era, right?
Well, you know, the quote that you started out with by Zsa Gabor, for example, is an excellent example. It was initially published in a small kind of photo journal, photo digest, which for 5-10 cents that you would have bought in the grocery store as you're checking out, kind of like a National Enquirer, but smaller. And that was from an article called "The 10 Most Exciting Men in the World." So he actually made these 10 sexy lists in the 50s. So yeah, there was something about this. This kind of outdoors rugged expertise and bluster that lent itself to, I guess, sexiness or literary sexiness, as they describe it. But I think that also has an awful lot to do with kind of the dynamics of gender in the 1950s, which were much more extreme than we think of now. Again, when you look at these men's magazines next to, say, an Esquire or a Details from today, it is miles and miles away from the kind of metrosexual, there was something going on in the 1950s, which this book is also an exploration of.
You also talk a little bit about how the perception that men had of women in those days. Elaborate on that some.
Well, in the 1950s, and there are also quite a few reasons for this that I go into in detail, but it just seems like in popular culture, the roles of gender, the kind of socialization of gender roles was very extreme. And this existed in both men's magazines and women's magazines. When you think of the kind of icon of Doris Day in the pink kitchen, right, where all the stoves, the refrigerators, everything there, pink, pastel-y, and women just want to be in there, and you know, waiting with the martini for their husbands. This type of pressure on women, which has to do with kind of getting them out of the World War II factories and getting them back into the domestic sphere, getting them back into the home. The same thing's happening. This kind of extreme, almost stereotype of gender is happening with men as well. Suburban men are kind of trying to counterbalance that how shall I say it, that suburban role or the corporate role by being weekend adventurers, by the fix-it-yourself or do-it-yourself kind of ideology. Unfortunately, in a lot of these magazines, because of the trauma of war, because of the kind of wholesale let's say disparity between this image of masculinity previous to the Second World War and what happened in Europe. As they come back, there really is this kind of trauma of gender. And one of the side effects of that is this hyper-masculinity. When I say hyper-masculinity, what I mean by that is all those kind of cartoon almost characteristics of masculinity start getting promoted in popular culture. So we have magazines like Gem, the magazine for the masterful men, that has this manifesto in there that's incredibly and really troubling misogynistic, just about how society is dominated by women and we must take back the power. You know, and we read it now, and yeah, it's kind of hard to swallow. But there is so much of this, especially in these magazines, that that it's really problematic. And that again is one of the reasons behind this book, is to try and figure out exactly what's going on in culture at the time.
Interestingly enough, I guess that Hemingway, being this macho type guy on the covers of these magazines, I guess it was obviously a win-win for the magazine because he was popular, so they sold more. I think we have some pictures of some of the magazines that he was on there that we can show. But there you go, right there, some of what we were talking about, and you can certainly expand on that if you will.
Oh yeah, Rugged Men. This is one of many of the adventure magazines, men's adventure magazines. And when I talk about, I'll use the critical term like the trauma of gender. Say, what I really mean is, over the course of the Second World War, millions of men went into battle, and kind of the years previous to the Second World War didn't prepare that whole generation for the horrors that they saw, and no one at home actually knew what they were experiencing. So. Because of the whitewashing of the news. So when they actually returned to the United States, there was this disjunction between, what we expect our men to be like, and or what courage is, and things like this, to what men had actually experienced. Post-traumatic stress is a terrible problem after the Second World War. So what the extremity of these magazines did by talking about men triumphant, for example, is they provided a narrative of how to cope, how to deal, how to repair the kind of shortcomings of that type of gender construction. That's exactly what Hemingway's fiction does after the First World War. Right? Hemingway's fiction is about, what happens, there's the narrative before the First World War of pure mind, pure body, Theodore Roosevelt, adventure, physical culture. Right. Well, you get over to the First World War and there's trench warfare, and they're terrible, terrible technological war. They're, gassing. There's, the first tanks, bombs, artillery, things like this. Well, all those aspects previous to the First World War don't prepare an 18-year-old for that.
Right.
So this is the type of narrative that Hemingway is enthralled with, right? Courage under pressure. Of course, because of the extremity of these magazines in the 1950s, that kind of pick up on this idea of Hemingway as the masterful soldier or the rugged man. There's a reaction against him. There's a reading of him as misogynistic when the 60s and 70s come around with the rise of feminism. And it's understandable, given the extremities of the magazines that he's being published in, or that are publishing about him, if that makes sense. So,
what we talk about his persona from a public standpoint, and you talked about, or a little bit earlier in the interview, that he was a kind, a gentleman in person. Expand a little bit more on what he was like. If you were to sit down over a cup of coffee with Ernest Hemingway, what would it have been? What would the experience have been like?
I think he's a pretty complex person. I think it depends on what mood you got him in and if he was performing or not. Because we get different accounts. We get accounts of him, like the ones I heard about from my parents. We get accounts that he was very sweet, very gentle, and there are lots of things like this, incredibly giving. But then we also get accounts of him being blustery, of him starting fights, of him really kind of bristling at people. So it's this weird kind of dichotomy of the man. And I like to think that well, I don't know. I think meeting him would be great, except I think it would probably be pretty difficult to get along with, especially if you're going to talk literature with him, or if you're going to try and contrast with his role as expert. Not to say that I wouldn't like to sit down and have a daiquiri or a mojito or whatever it is with the guy.
I was going to say you probably wouldn't sit down and have a cup of coffee. It would probably be something a little stronger.
Probably, with him, I'm sure quite a bit stronger. So we hear tales of in these interviews, and I publish a few of the interviews from these men's magazines of more or less what seems like starry-eyed kids, journalists who hunt him down in Cuba and track him down and kind of invade his personal space. And usually he's very cantankerous, but then he softens up and he actually talks about literature, he talks about politics, he talks about sports, he talks about drinking, he talks about women, he talks about, again, it's this role as expert. And I think if you were to let him be that, like conform to that role, I think that you'd probably get along with him well.
I will.
Yeah.
What was his political persuasion?
Well, it depends on when you're talking about. You know, as a young man, he's definitely growing out of the kind of turn of the century sort of Teddy Roosevelt, physical culture, Boy Scout almost, almost idea. By the 1930s, he, like many of the intellectuals at the time, is definitely has kind of leftist feelings. You know, he was incredibly involved with all the anti-fascist brigades in the Spanish Civil War. But again, so were an awful lot of intellectuals and a lot of writers there. You know, he saw the dangers of fascism. He saw the dangers that would eventually become, you know, Hitler in the Second World War, National Socialism in the Second World War. And, you know, during the height of the Depression, like so many writers, he was definitely had kind of socialist leanings. He wrote for a magazine called The New Masses, which was a socialist magazine. He wrote about the terrible treatment of vets from the Second World War and how the government actually left them in the Keys when the hurricane hit. And eventually wrote about this in To Have and Have Not, right? Well, the same vets. To Have and Have Not has this proletariat kind of novel. But at the same time, I don't think he ever would allow himself to be categorized in a single kind of political camp. I think much more he was just kind of humanist, right? Of course, by the 1950s, there's some odd kind of statements, you know, Cold War statements. There's one interview that I believe I'm the first person to have republished it in this book. There's one interview where he actually says that Franco was necessary to kind of defend Spain for the Christians against the kind of communist and socialist horrors. And there were horrors on both sides, and he knew this during the Spanish Civil War. But at the same time, you then see with a statement like that a distancing between that earlier socialism, and that, of course, I think is just kind of the Cold War politics of the moment. Right?
Take me to the last few years of his life. You said your parents had some involvement with him, but you know, take me up to his death.
Sure. Well, I mean, he he lived a vibrant life. He put himself in great risk lots of times, which means that he had at least 6 concussions. I'd have to sit down and talk about them. Right. Wow. 2 different plane crashes, auto accidents. And I think by the time that he was in his late 50s, by 58, 59, 56, 60, his body was absolutely failing him. And his such a physical guy, this was something that was hard for him to kind of accept. You know, terrible hypertension, bouts of depression, which he actually suffered from most of his life. I think there's a genetic family history of depression. Actually, unquestionably. So I think this, his kind of inability in his writing to sort of edit himself at this point, which was always, I mean, you know, he's the super editor, right? He edits himself down to the bare bone, all muscle and gristle, right? And I think all these things really kind of affected him and helped to explain why he eventually did take his own life. So, you know, a sad story of someone failing and frail and not able to handle aging, I think, to the degree that many of us do. So,
well, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't for the longest time it was covered up that he actually committed suicide?
Well, they couldn't really cover it up too much. Only for a few weeks.
Okay, so only a few weeks.
Only a few weeks. The men's magazine that are published after that, and there's of course a huge spurt of articles after his death and biographies and stuff. They more or less are in disbelief of the fact that he possibly could have killed himself. You know, America's #1 He-Man, you know, could not have done this. You know, this is, I think, symbolic of what happens to this 1950s hypermasculinity. The men's magazines themselves by the 60s are all kind of degenerated or gone, you know. And I think that this is almost the death toll of that type of 1950s popular culture misogyny and other such things as well. He was a symbol throughout the 1950s.
Pretty brutal suicide, too.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I've read the doctor's reports on it, and very brutal. Earlier, you know, he had gone to the Mayo Clinic, and tried to walk into an airplane propeller. You know, he was on 24-hour watch when he was in the hospital, and I think you know, we can conjecture about reasons. Ultimately, it's a moot point. You know, I like to think that the extremity of this public persona that is out of his hands by the 1950s, right? This hyper masculine persona.
It's taken a life of its own.
Absolutely taken a life of its own, and he must see that, and that has to put pressure on him. That has to kind of, you know, this is the sad thing about celebrity and celebrity culture. You know, when someone's persona and their person get so intertangled that even the person themselves can't distinguish. You know? And you know, the 50s with all the gossip magazines, which I write about, you know, on the QT, Hush Hush, stuff like that, they really went after Hemingway, as they did almost all celebrities. There were articles about alcoholism, there were articles about impotency, there were articles about violence, things like this. So, you know, to be a celebrity and to face that, I think must have been, especially someone who really ultimately was very, very sensitive and I think pretty insecure, that really must have taken a toll on him. So,
it's a fascinating book. It's called All Man Hemingway, 1950s Men's Magazines and the Masculine Persona. How can someone get a copy of the book?
Well, it's available on Amazon. Is probably just about the easiest. You can get it also through Kent State University Press. Independent bookstores hopefully carry it. You can ask an independent bookstore or actually for that matter, Books A Millions or Barnes and Noble would be happy to order it for you if they don't have it. But Amazon's probably the easiest thing to do.
So some interesting pictures in here. Kind of make a nice coffee table book as well, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, it's a smart coffee table book. I like to think of it as. So,
That's great. Anything else in the pipeline, book-wise?
Book-wise, down the road. Right now, I'm writing on flappers of the 20s and gun malls and gangsters. So, and in popular cultures and pulp magazines of the 1920s.
Awesome, awesome. Dr. David Earle, thanks.
Great. Well,
enjoyed
absolutely.
It. We enjoyed it. Learned a lot about Ernest Hemingway. It's a fascinating book. It's called All Man Hemingway, 1950s Men's Magazines and the Masculine Persona. Interesting stuff. Well, some of our past shows are online. You can find them at WSRE.org/conversations. Just click the episodes tab and you can search out some of the wonderful guests that we've had on this program. Of course, Dr. Earle will be online as well if you want to watch it again. We greatly appreciate you watching this edition of Conversations. I'm Jeff Weeks. Take very good care of yourself and we'll see you soon.